The train moved through the tunnels with its usual rhythm, loud but familiar, the kind of background noise most passengers stopped noticing after a few minutes. Inside the subway car, people stood close or sat quietly, absorbed in their own routines. Some scrolled through their phones, others stared ahead without focus, and a few glanced occasionally at the stops as the train slowed and accelerated again. It was an ordinary moment in New York City, one of thousands that happen every day without leaving any trace behind. Nothing about it suggested that this ride would be remembered. The atmosphere carried that typical distance between strangers. No one spoke unless they needed to. Eye contact was brief and often avoided. Each person occupied their own space mentally, even if physically they were only inches apart. The environment was predictable, structured by routine and repetition. Then a shift began. A man stepped into clearer view within the car, not positioned in a seat or against the wall, but standing where he could be seen by multiple people at once. His presence didn't immediately trigger alarm, but it drew attention in a subtle way. There was movement in how he carried himself, something restless, something that didn't align with the stillness around him. He began to speak. At first, his voice blended into the general noise of the train. In a city like New York, hearing someone talk loudly in a subway car is not unusual. Most people instinctively filter it out, assuming it will pass. But this time, the tone was different enough to hold attention a little longer. His voice was sharper, more forceful, and carried an urgency that made it difficult to ignore. The words came quickly, not in a calm or structured way, but in bursts that reflected frustration and intensity. He spoke about being tired, about being hungry, about not caring anymore. The message was not organized, but the emotion behind it was clear. Passengers began to notice. Not all at once, but gradually as individuals lifted their heads, turning slightly to look without fully engaging. Some kept their eyes down but listened more closely. Others watched directly, trying to understand whether the situation would escalate or settle on its own. No one moved immediately. That hesitation was important. In confined public spaces, people often wait, hoping that whatever is happening will resolve without intervention. It is a shared instinct shaped by routine. Most disturbances in a subway car end quickly, fading back into the background without consequence. For a moment it seemed like that might happen here as well. But the tone continued to rise. The man's voice grew louder, more insistent, and more difficult to dismiss. His words repeated in different forms, circling around the same frustrations. There was no clear direction, no specific target, but the intensity created a different kind of pressure inside the car. The environment began to change. Passengers shifted slightly, creating small pockets of space where they could. Some repositioned themselves without making it obvious. Others remained still but became more alert, their attention focused even if their posture did not change. The train kept moving, but inside the car the atmosphere no longer felt routine. The space was limited. The exits were controlled. And that made every decision feel more immediate. The man continued speaking, his voice now carrying across the entire car. It was no longer something people could ignore. It demanded attention whether they wanted to give it or not. The distance between strangers, which had once felt natural, now felt fragile. Awareness turned into tension. Some passengers exchanged brief glances, silent signals that something was wrong. Others avoided looking altogether, focusing instead on staying still and waiting. The uncertainty shaped every reaction. No one knew what would happen next, and that lack of clarity made the moment heavier. The train did not stop. The movement continued. And that meant the situation had to be dealt with inside the car itself. At this point, the line between disturbance and threat became harder to define. There were no clear instructions, no authority stepping in, only individuals making decisions based on what they felt in that moment. And then, someone acted. The movement was quick and direct. One passenger stepped forward, closing the distance that others had tried to maintain. The intention, from an outside perspective, appeared to be control, an attempt to manage the situation before it escalated further. But in a confined space, actions like that carry immediate consequences. Physical contact was made. The shift was instant. What had been verbal became physical, and that changed the entire dynamic inside the car. Passengers who had remained still now reacted, some stepping back to create space, others watching closely, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. The train continued its route, but inside, everything had changed. The environment became more intense, more focused, and more uncertain at the same time. Every movement mattered now. Every second carried weight. There was no longer any distance between observation and involvement. Some passengers moved further away, pressing themselves against doors or corners, trying to stay clear of what was unfolding. Others remained closer, their attention fixed on the interaction, ready to react if necessary. The confined space amplified everything. There was no room for gradual escalation, only immediate reaction. The man's voice, which had filled the car moments earlier, was now replaced by movement and control. The focus shifted completely from what he had been saying to what was happening physically. The energy in the car changed from uncertain tension to something more defined, but not necessarily more stable. Time began to feel different. Moments stretched longer than they should have. People watched without speaking, their decisions held back by uncertainty. No one had a full understanding of the situation, only fragments shaped by what they could see from where they stood. The train approached the next station, but the sense of routine did not return. The normal sequence of doors opening and closing, passengers entering and exiting, felt disconnected from what was happening inside. The situation did not pause. It continued. Passengers who had entered the car at previous stops now found themselves part of something they had not anticipated. Their reactions were shaped instantly, without context, without preparation. Inside that space, multiple realities existed at once. Some saw control. Some saw danger. Some saw confusion. Each perspective influenced how they responded, but none of them provided a complete picture. The movement remained focused, contained within a small section of the car, but its impact extended to everyone inside. Even those who were not directly involved felt the shift, the tension, the weight of a moment that had moved far beyond routine. No one spoke loudly now. No one tried to return to normal. The atmosphere held steady in a state of heightened awareness, where every detail mattered and every second felt important. The train continued forward, carrying everyone inside it, but the experience was no longer shared in the same way. Each person processed the moment differently, but all of them understood that something significant was happening. And as the situation continued to unfold, one thing became clear. This was no longer just another subway disturbance. It had crossed into something that would not be forgotten. Something that would not remain inside that train. Because what was happening in that confined space was about to extend far beyond it, into conversations, into questions, and into a level of attention that no one inside that car could fully anticipate. The moment had already begun to define itself. And it was only just beginning. As the situation moved beyond the subway car and onto the platform, the environment changed in a way that immediately affected how people responded. What had been confined and uncertain was now visible and exposed, and that visibility brought a different kind of attention. Transit staff, nearby passengers, and others on the platform quickly became aware that something was wrong, even if they did not yet understand the full context. Inside the car, those who had been closest to the interaction remained focused, but the shift in environment introduced new variables. The presence of others outside the situation created both pressure and structure. Movement that had been contained now extended outward, and the moment could no longer continue in isolation. Passengers who stepped onto the platform began sharing fragments of what they had seen. Their descriptions were brief and often incomplete, shaped by perspective rather than full awareness. Some focused on the earlier behavior, others on the physical interaction, but no single account captured the entire sequence. Still, those fragments were enough to signal that this was not a routine disturbance. Communication spread quickly. Voices overlapped. Questions repeated. What happened in there? Is he okay? Did someone call for help? The answers remained uncertain, but the urgency behind the questions made the situation feel larger than the space it had come from. Inside the response that began to form, attention shifted toward control and assessment. The immediate goal was to stabilize the environment, ensuring that no further escalation occurred. Those closest to the situation adjusted their actions, responding not only to what was happening in front of them, but also to the growing presence around them. The dynamic had changed. It was no longer just about managing a moment. It was about managing its impact. Time continued to feel uneven as the situation developed. What had started as a short interaction now extended across multiple minutes, each one carrying more weight than the last. The normal flow of the subway system had been interrupted, even if only slightly, and that interruption drew more attention. People on the platform began to step back, creating space without being instructed. The tension was visible even to those who had not been inside the car. Movement slowed, and the usual rush that defines a subway station gave way to hesitation. Inside the interaction, focus remained on control, but the outcome was still unclear. The earlier intensity had shifted into something more contained, yet no one could say with certainty how the situation would resolve. That uncertainty shaped every decision. Some passengers chose to stay nearby, watching closely, ready to respond if needed. Others moved further away, creating distance not just physically but mentally, separating themselves from the moment. At the same time, the first structured responses began to take shape. Authorities were notified, and the expectation of official involvement introduced a new layer of attention. The situation was no longer defined only by those present. It was now part of a larger system that would respond in its own way. The presence of that system changed how the moment was perceived. It added form to uncertainty. It introduced the idea that what was happening would be documented, reviewed, and understood beyond the immediate experience. Inside the developing response, the focus began to shift again. The initial priority of managing the situation transitioned into assessing its condition. What had happened, how it had happened, and what the current state was became central questions. The answers were still forming, but the direction was clear. The event had moved beyond a moment of reaction and into a moment of consequence. Passengers who had witnessed the beginning now found themselves part of a larger narrative. Their perspectives, once personal and immediate, would become pieces of a broader understanding. Each detail they remembered would contribute to how the event was reconstructed later. Outside the immediate area, information continued to spread. Messages were sent, calls were made, and early reports began to appear, each one carrying fragments of the same story. The event was no longer limited to a single location. It was expanding. Inside the station, the atmosphere settled into a tense stillness. Movement resumed in small ways, but it was cautious, measured, and influenced by what had just taken place. The normal rhythm had not fully returned, and it would not return easily, because what had started as a disturbance inside a moving train had now become something that extended far beyond that moment. It had crossed into public awareness, into conversation, and into a level of attention that would continue to grow. The sequence was no longer contained. It was unfolding. And with each passing moment, the focus shifted further away from what had happened in the beginning and closer to what it meant going forward. As authorities arrived and took control of the scene, the situation moved into a more structured phase. What had unfolded inside a confined subway car was now being examined in an open, controlled environment where every detail mattered. The immediate focus was no longer just on managing the moment, but on understanding it clearly and accurately. Officers began separating individuals who had been directly involved from those who had only witnessed the event. This separation allowed for a more organized assessment, ensuring that information could be gathered without confusion or overlap. Each person carried a different perspective, shaped by where they stood, what they saw, and how they reacted. Witness accounts began to form the foundation of the timeline. Some described the early moments when the man first started speaking, emphasizing how the tone of his voice had shifted the atmosphere inside the train. Others focused on the point where the situation became physical, explaining how quickly that transition had changed everything. A few spoke about the confined space itself, noting how the lack of distance made every action feel more immediate and more intense. While the details varied, the sequence remained consistent. A verbal disturbance, rising tension, a sudden shift into physical control. Investigators listened carefully, not just to the words but to the structure of each account. The goal was not to rely on a single version of events, but to align multiple perspectives into a clear and consistent sequence. This process required precision, as even small differences could affect how the situation was understood. At the same time, surveillance footage from the station and surrounding areas was reviewed. These recordings provided a broader view, capturing movements that individual witnesses might not have noticed. When combined with personal accounts, they helped reinforce the timeline, confirming the order in which events had unfolded. Inside this developing analysis, the focus expanded beyond what happened to how it happened. The environment of the subway car became a central factor. The limited space, the inability to easily leave, and the constant motion of the train all contributed to the intensity of the moment. These conditions shaped how people reacted and how quickly the situation escalated. Communication between units improved as more information became available. What had initially been uncertain was now becoming structured, allowing decisions to be made with greater clarity. The early confusion had given way to a coordinated effort to understand the full context. Outside the immediate scene, the event began to attract wider attention. Reports started to circulate, first in fragments and then in more defined forms. Each version carried its own emphasis, highlighting different aspects of the situation, but all pointed to the same central fact. Something significant had happened. Public interest grew quickly, driven not only by the nature of the event, but by the questions it raised. The situation did not fit neatly into a single explanation. It involved behavior, reaction, environment, and decision-making, all interacting in a way that was difficult to simplify. Inside the investigation, those complexities were addressed carefully. Each element was examined on its own, then placed back into the larger sequence to see how it connected. This approach ensured that no single factor was overemphasized while others were overlooked. Interviews continued with a focus on clarity rather than speed. Witnesses were asked to describe specific moments, to recall details about positioning, timing, and movement. These questions were designed to reduce uncertainty and build a more precise understanding of the sequence. Gradually, the picture became clearer. Not because one piece of information explained everything, but because multiple pieces aligned without contradiction. The timeline held. The sequence made sense. And the environment in which it happened explained why it unfolded the way it did. As this clarity developed, the focus shifted once again. The immediate questions about what happened were being answered. Now, attention turned toward what the event meant and how it would be understood beyond the scene itself. The incident had already moved beyond the subway system. It had entered public discussion. It had become a subject of debate. And that transition introduced a new layer of complexity, one that extended far beyond the physical space where it began. Inside the structured response, however, the objective remained the same. Understand the sequence. Confirm the details. Present a complete and accurate account. Because only with that level of clarity could the event be fully understood, not just as a moment, but as a sequence of actions shaped by conditions that came together in a way no one inside that train could have predicted. As the investigation continued, the focus expanded beyond the immediate scene and into the broader context of what had happened. The sequence inside the subway car had been largely established, but understanding the full impact required looking at how the event was perceived outside of it. Information began to move quickly through news outlets, social platforms, and public discussion, each source adding its own interpretation to the same set of events. The story was no longer contained. It was being shaped in real time. Early reports focused on the visible sequence: a man speaking loudly, rising tension, and a physical intervention that followed. These details formed the core of the narrative, but they did not answer the larger questions. Why did it escalate the way it did? What factors influenced the decisions made in that moment? Could it have unfolded differently? Those questions drove the next phase of attention. Inside the investigation, analysts continued to review every available detail, ensuring that the timeline remained accurate and consistent. Witness accounts were compared again, not because they were unreliable, but because subtle differences in perspective could reveal additional context. Surveillance footage was examined frame by frame, focusing on movement, positioning, and timing. Each layer of information reinforced the same sequence. Nothing suggested randomness. Everything followed a pattern shaped by environment and reaction. At the same time, public discussion began to divide into different viewpoints. Some focused on the behavior that initiated the tension, pointing to the intensity of the situation inside the train. Others focused on the response, questioning whether the actions taken were appropriate or necessary under those conditions. These perspectives did not cancel each other out, but they highlighted the complexity of the moment. The event was not simple. It could not be reduced to a single explanation. Inside the subway car, decisions had been made in seconds, without full information, in a confined space where options were limited. Outside that space, those same decisions were now being examined in detail, with time, distance, and perspective shaping how they were understood. This difference created tension in how the story was told. Some accounts emphasized urgency. Others emphasized consequence. Both were part of the same reality. Investigators remained focused on maintaining a clear and accurate structure, avoiding assumptions while documenting what could be confirmed. The goal was not to align with any interpretation, but to present a sequence that reflected what actually occurred. Background information also became part of the analysis. Not as a way to define the event, but as a way to understand the circumstances surrounding it. Details about the individuals involved, their movements prior to the incident, and the conditions within the subway system all contributed to a broader picture. These elements added depth, but they did not change the core sequence. The event still followed the same progression: verbal disturbance, rising tension, physical intervention, aftermath and response. Outside the investigation, the impact continued to grow. The story reached a wider audience, and with that reach came stronger reactions. Discussions became more detailed, more emotional, and more divided. The same moment was being viewed through different lenses, each shaped by personal perspective and belief. Inside the structured process, however, the objective remained consistent. clarity over assumption, sequence over speculation. Every detail had to fit within the timeline without contradiction. If it did not, it was re-examined until it either aligned or was set aside. This approach ensured that the final understanding would be based on verified information rather than interpretation. As more details were confirmed, the case moved closer to completion. The uncertainty that had defined the early moments was replaced by a clearer understanding of how the event unfolded and why it escalated the way it did. But even with that clarity, one element remained: the impact. For those who had been inside the subway car, the experience did not end when the train stopped. It stayed with them, shaped by what they had seen and how quickly everything had changed. The transition from routine to tension had been immediate, and that shift left a lasting impression. For those outside the event, the impact came through information, through repeated exposure to the same sequence from different angles. Each retelling reinforced the significance of the moment, ensuring that it would not fade quickly. The event had moved beyond a single location. It had become part of a larger conversation. And as that conversation continued, the focus remained on understanding not just what happened, but how a moment like that could develop so quickly in a space that was meant to feel routine and controlled. As the case reached its final stage, the focus shifted from gathering information to presenting a complete and verified understanding of what had happened. The sequence inside the subway car was no longer uncertain. It had been reconstructed through multiple sources, each one aligning with the same structure, each one reinforcing the same progression of events. What began as an ordinary ride had followed a clear path. A verbal disturbance that changed the atmosphere. A rise in tension shaped by a confined environment. A physical intervention that altered the course of the moment. And an aftermath that extended far beyond the train itself. Inside the investigation, every detail was reviewed again, not to discover something new, but to confirm that nothing had been misunderstood. Witness accounts, surveillance footage, and timeline analysis all pointed in the same direction. There were no major gaps, no contradictions strong enough to change the structure. The event was no longer a question. It was a defined sequence. At the same time, the broader impact continued to develop outside the investigation. Public discussion did not slow down. Instead, it became more focused, more detailed, and more divided. Different perspectives continued to shape how the moment was understood, each one emphasizing a different part of the same sequence. Some focused on the conditions inside the subway car, pointing to the confined space, the limited options, and the pressure that influenced decisions made in seconds. Others focused on the outcome, questioning whether the situation could have been handled differently and what responsibility existed within that moment. These perspectives did not cancel each other out. They existed together, reflecting the complexity of what had happened. Inside the structured analysis, however, the goal remained unchanged. The purpose was not to resolve every debate, but to establish what could be confirmed without assumption. That distinction was important, because it separated interpretation from evidence. And the evidence remained consistent. The environment had played a critical role. The subway car, with its limited space and controlled exits, created a situation where distance could not be easily created and decisions could not be delayed. The normal rules of movement did not apply in the same way, and that influenced how quickly the situation escalated. Timing was another factor. The transition from verbal tension to physical action happened within a narrow window, leaving little room for alternative responses. In that kind of moment, decisions are shaped more by immediate perception than by long-term reasoning. Awareness also varied across individuals. Some passengers recognized the shift earlier, while others reacted only when the situation became physical. These differences affected how each person experienced the event, but they did not change the overall sequence. Together, these elements explain not only what happened but how it unfolded so quickly. Outside the investigation, the event continued to carry weight. It was no longer just a moment that occurred inside a subway car. It had become part of a larger discussion about behavior, response, and the complexity of decision-making in confined public spaces. For those who had been present, the experience remained personal. The memory of that moment, the shift from routine to tension, and the uncertainty that followed did not disappear when the train stopped. It stayed with them, shaped by how quickly everything had changed. For others, the event existed through information, through reports, footage, and repeated retellings. Each version added another layer of understanding, but also another layer of interpretation. Inside the final report, however, the structure remained clear. The sequence was defined. The details were confirmed. And the event was understood in full, not as a single moment of chaos, but as a progression shaped by environment, timing, and human reaction. The day did not begin with significance. It became significant because of how quickly everything changed. And in the end, what remained was not just the memory of what happened, but the clarity of how it happened and why it unfolded the way it did. A reminder that even in the most routine environments, moments can shift without warning, and when they do, the outcome is shaped not by a single action, but by a sequence that builds faster than anyone expects. And once that sequence begins, it cannot simply be undone. It can only be understood.